In the Chicago of the 1960s, an extravagant and barbaric figure emerged from the depths of the criminal underworld. Known nationwide for his cruel and capricious behavior, the mere mention of his name was enough to instill fear in both friends and enemies. His name was Anthony Spilotro, and despite his short stature, he built a terrifying reputation as a cold-blooded killer. This led the bosses of the Chicago outfit to personally entrust him with overseeing their lucrative operations in Las Vegas and ensuring that everyone stayed in line. But Tony had much bigger aspirations, and in the end, his overwhelming need to always be the center of attention would lead to his surprising downfall and jeopardize everything the Mafia had built in Las Vegas. Tony was born on May 19, 1938, on the south side of Chicago. He grew up in a small two-story house in an Italian neighborhood where he shared a single bedroom with his 5 brothers. His father, Pasquale Spilotro, owned and operated a restaurant called Patsy's, a small delicatessen famous throughout Chicago for its homemade meatballs. It was also a popular gathering place for high-ranking Chicago mobsters like Sam Giancana, Jackie Cerrone, Gus Alex, and Frank Nitti. Like many neighborhood kids, young Tony idolized these hardened gangsters and performed numerous menial tasks for them, such as fetching their coffee, picking up their dry cleaning, or shining their shoes. One day, while carrying out this last task, Tony met Frank Carlotta for the first time. Both were carrying shoe shine boxes and got into a heated argument over who was allowed to shine shoes on Grand Avenue. They pushed each other a bit, but eventually, each went their separate ways. Shortly after, Tony's father heard his son mention Frank and wanted to know if Frank was related to Joe Carlotta. A couple of years earlier, Tony's father had been harassed by some local criminals demanding protection money. Instead of paying, he turned to Joe, who was a feared gangster in their neighborhood and known as the best driver in town. The extortionists withdrew, and Joe was killed in a shootout with the police a couple of months later. Despite this, Tony's father felt a sense of loyalty to Joe's memory and ordered his son to end his feud with Frank. The two became friends and formed a small gang that included Tony's brothers as well as other local youths. Despite his short stature, Tony quickly earned a reputation as the toughest kid in the neighborhood, so much so that his older brother Victor would offer money to other kids if they could beat Tony in a fight. Usually, Tony could handle himself, but if it looked like the other kid was going to win, the entire gang would jump in and give the opponent a brutal beating. Initially, Tony's gang engaged in petty crimes like vandalism and breaking and entering. However, it wasn't long before they moved on to armed robbery. One particularly lucrative plan involved one of the members waiting inside a bank until they saw someone withdraw a large sum of money. The gang would follow the person and rob them when they were alone. According to Frank, this plan was so successful that some months they made unimaginable amounts of money. At 17 years old, Frank was determined to enjoy his newfound wealth and bought himself a new Cadillac. Tony, however, had other ideas. He used his share of the robbery money to ingratiate himself with the Chicago Mafia. When he saw the Cadillac, he even warned Frank to return it because he knew that if anyone affiliated with the organization saw it, they would come after Frank and demand a share of his ill-gotten gains. It wasn't long before Tony started to associate with an enforcer for the organization named Vincent the Saint Incero. Despite being even shorter than Tony, Vincent had a fearsome reputation as a ruthless killer. Through Vincent, Tony was introduced to important members of the organization. Even in those early days, Tony had a single goal in mind, telling Frank one day, "Someday, I'm going to be the boss of everything." Tony was eager to prove his worth, and his opportunity would come on a fateful day in 1962. Two members of Frank's robbery gang, Billy McCarthy and Jimmy Moralia, had recently been involved in an altercation at a bar owned by the organization. The two had been drinking excessively and acting belligerently, leading to them being beaten and thrown out of the bar by the Scalvo brothers, Ronnie and Philip. Embarrassed, Billy and Jimmy vowed revenge. A couple of weeks later, they parked their car outside the bar and waited for the brothers to finish their shift. When they saw the brothers, along with one of their girlfriends, get into a car and leave, they followed them. After trailing them for a while, they saw their opportunity when the brothers drove into an upscale residential area called Elmwood Park. As the brothers' car stopped at a stop sign, Billy and Jimmy approached and opened fire. Philip was shot in the neck, causing him to put the car in reverse and crash. Their car crashed into a nearby house. Jimmy and Billy emptied their guns into the car, killing all three occupants. This incident quickly became a major scandal for the organization. Elmwood Park was one of the most prestigious neighborhoods in all of Chicago, home to many politicians and high-ranking mobsters. For this reason, everyone understood that committing crimes in Elmwood Park was absolutely forbidden. A couple of days later, Frank received a call from Tony asking him to meet at a nearby bowling alley. When Frank arrived, he noticed a drastic change in Tony's usual behavior. He was entirely focused on business. Tony noticed Frank's anxiety and reassured him, saying they were fine, but needed him to call Billy and tell him they needed to meet that night. Tony even provided a lie, instructing Frank to tell Billy they had a big job planned and needed to meet urgently. Frank was hesitant, but Tony insisted he just wanted to talk to Billy and see if he had any information. Since Tony didn't mention Jimmy, Frank thought he was telling the truth. Frank called Billy to arrange the meeting at a restaurant called the Chicken House. Then, the two got into Frank's car and started driving toward the restaurant. On the way, Tony said they needed to make a quick stop at another restaurant first. Upon arriving at the parking lot, Tony got out of the car and had a brief conversation with the driver of a dark blue Ford. Then Tony told Frank to get out of his car and get into the Ford. Frank got in and realized the driver was none other than Vincent the Saint. The two sat in complete silence while Tony took Frank's car and drove away. 40 minutes later, Tony returned and simply said, "Don't worry, everything went well," then got into Vincent's car and left. That night, Billy's wife called Frank to ask if he had seen her husband, as it was unusual for him to be out so late. Frank lied and said he had no idea what had happened to him, then went to sleep. 3 days later, Frank met Jimmy at a restaurant. Frank warned him that Billy had disappeared and told him he should leave town. Jimmy responded, "Why? I have nothing to run from or hide." A week later, the police found the bodies of Billy and Jimmy in the trunk of Jimmy's abandoned car. The next day, Frank received a call from Tony, who told him they needed to talk. Jubilant, Tony explained what had happened. He claimed that he would soon become a made man within the organization. When Frank asked why, Tony recounted the story of Billy's last moments. Tony had taken Frank's car and parked it right in front of the meeting restaurant before going inside. When Billy arrived and saw Frank's car, he assumed Frank was already inside waiting for him. Entering the restaurant, Billy saw Tony sitting alone in a booth. Tony called him over and said he was also waiting for Frank. They sat together for a while and chatted before Billy decided he no longer wanted to wait and left. As Tony and Billy exited the restaurant, they were followed by two men who had been sitting separately inside. Just as Billy opened his car door, he was surrounded by Tony and those two men, whom he soon recognized as high-ranking Mafia hitmen. The three men tied Billy up and forced him to lie on the car floor. Tony then returned Frank's car, while his associates took Billy to a Mafia-controlled workshop. When Tony arrived at the workshop later, Billy was already undergoing torture. For the next few hours, the three men relentlessly worked on Billy, intent on making him reveal his accomplice's name by any means necessary. Despite their efforts, Billy remained silent. It wasn't until Tony dragged him to a workbench and placed his head in a vise that Billy finally cracked. Tony tightened the vise until one of Billy's eyes popped out, prompting him to divulge the name they were seeking. Tony believed that such a brutal display would soon earn him official recognition. However, his fortunes quickly changed not long after, when one of Sam Giancana's top hitmen was in New York on business. Someone had broken into his home and stolen over $400,000. They had also held a gun to his wife's face and stolen all her jewelry. The hitman went berserk upon hearing about the incident and did everything possible to find the culprit, including having corrupt cops bring him thousands of mugshots for his wife to review. But it was all in vain. 2 weeks passed, and he was no closer to identifying the thief. Then, one of his underlings suggested that the only person they knew capable of such a job was Tony Spilotro. With no other leads, he ordered Tony to come to his house. Tony knew an invitation like that spelled trouble, so he asked his good friend, Frank Lefty Rosenthal, to accompany him. Although Lefty was 9 years older than Tony, they were close friends who had grown up in the same neighborhood and frequented the same circles. Lefty was a renowned sports bettor in the criminal underworld, known as one of the best in the business. He worked closely with several high-ranking Mafia figures, including the hitman in question. When the two arrived, they were led to the basement where they met Sam Giancana's hitman. He ordered Tony to sit in a chair and then asked, "Do you know what happened to me?" Tony replied, "Yes, I heard," with an annoyed tone. When asked if he knew anyone who could have done such a thing, Tony curtly answered, "No." The hitman pressed, "Are you sure?" Tony sarcastically replied, "I already answered that question." Instantly, the hitman threw Tony to the floor and began to strangle him. Tony later told Frank that he thought he was going to die. However, Lefty intervened immediately, telling the hitman that Tony had a big mouth, but meant no disrespect. Finally, the hitman let Tony go with a warning. "I don't want to see you around here ever again. If I find out you knew about what happened at my house and didn't tell me, I'll erase your whole family." While this incident posed a threat to his life, it didn't hinder his career, as Tony eventually became a made man and was put in charge of a major gambling operation in northwest Chicago. He also had numerous teams of thieves operating across the city under his command. Tony had earned a reputation as a master thief, known for quickly assembling skilled teams, capable of robbing locations without triggering alarms or leaving witnesses. He also ran a lucrative loan sharking business alongside the infamous gangster Samuel Mad Sam De Stefano. For a brief period, Tony even worked as a bail bondsman with credentials provided by the Mafia. The purpose of this new occupation was for Tony to access sensitive court documents that his bosses hoped would reveal the identities of FBI undercover informants. From the courthouse, Tony obtained the identity and address of an FBI agent named William Romer. One day, Tony followed Romer as he left the gym to an isolated area of Columbus Park. Hiding behind a corner, Tony waited to see who would meet with an undercover informant, but instead found himself face to face with Romer, who pointed a gun directly at him. "Are you looking for me, buddy?" Romer asked. "Just taking a stroll." "Isn't this a public park?" Tony replied sarcastically, evading every question Romer threw at him. When asked why he was following him, Tony retorted, "Who's following you? I'm just walking in the park." Romer didn't believe him. "Doesn't matter what you believe," Tony shot back defiantly. Romer changed tactics, advising Tony that he was still young with his whole life ahead, urging him not to waste it on a life of crime. Tony, unmoved, countered, "Then I should live like you? I've seen how you live, seen your big house. Why would I want to live like you?" Even with a gun pointed at him by a man almost twice his size, Tony remained unfazed, maintaining his challenging attitude, a demeanor the FBI agent would later describe as "that was Tony. He dared you to kill him." It was through this encounter that Tony earned his infamous nickname. Whenever a colleague or media contact asked about him, Agent Romer would say, "Who are you referring to, that little squirt?" However, due to the standards of the time, such a word was not suitable for publication. Consequently, whenever he appeared in newspapers, they instead called him Tony the Ant. Although his short stature was clearly a strong hypothesis for the origin of his nickname, this creation by the press would not have been his first choice. Tony loved the attention he received from the media and enjoyed making faces for the cameras as he passed by. While most mobsters preferred to keep their names out of the newspapers, Tony reveled in it and always sought to attract attention. Tony frequently performed tricks to ensure his name remained in the headlines. Though the media loved to follow Tony, their fascination was surpassed by the police, who had him under 24-hour surveillance. Law enforcement suspected he was involved in the brutal murders of Billy McCarthy and Jimmy Moralia, along with many other crimes. However, Tony was cunning and learned to evade police surveillance, often discussing business in coded language. In 1967, police raided Tony's house after learning he was running an illegal gambling den. He faced a fine, but avoided jail time. 2 years later, a tip-off led police to discover Tony overseeing a gambling operation inside an abandoned factory. His associates delayed police at the door, while Tony and the others quickly destroyed incriminating evidence like betting slips and financial records. When police finally entered, they found enough evidence to force Tony to pay another fine. With pressure mounting, a high-ranking member of the organization had a brilliant idea. Marshal Joseph Caifano, the current chief enforcer in Las Vegas, had been banned from all the city's casinos. Someone new needed to assume his role, and they believed Tony was the right man for the job due to his fearsome reputation. In this new role, Tony would work alongside his old friend Lefty Rosenthal to ensure that Chicago bosses continued to skim profits from the casinos smoothly. With the reputable Alan Glick as the casino owner, Lefty's task was to access the security rooms and siphon off as much money as possible before it was officially recorded as income, a task at which Lefty excelled. Tony, on the other hand, was tasked with closely monitoring Lefty and Glick ensuring that the money kept flowing back to Chicago. In 1971, Tony, his wife Nancy, and their 4-year-old son Vincent moved into a 3-bedroom house in a middle-class neighborhood in Las Vegas. Tony and Nancy quickly became friends with Lefty's family, especially his new wife, Jerry McGee. The two couples spent a lot of time together, whether at their homes or at the country club. He also attended all the Little League games in which his son played. Although Tony initially tried to create the facade of living a happy suburban life, his plan quickly unraveled the moment he set foot in Las Vegas. Local police and the FBI were alerted as the Chicago police sent over his record and all the evidence they had gathered on him. Almost immediately, the police began trailing Tony wherever he went, just as they had done in Chicago. However, he still managed to stay one step ahead of law enforcement and thwart their attempts to disrupt his plans. Tony had grand ambitions for Las Vegas and aimed to become an even more prominent figure, the city's most powerful crime boss. Fortunately for him, this wouldn't be too difficult to achieve. Before his arrival, Las Vegas was a relatively quiet and safe place. The Mafia generated so much money from their skimming operations in the casinos that they had made a concerted effort to keep the crime rate low. Keeping a low profile to avoid unwanted attention from the police, things were so calm that the city's biggest loan shark operated his business from his restaurant, Tower of Pizza, and his waitresses also acted as debt collectors. With Tony's arrival, everything changed. As one of the leading FBI agents working on Tony's case would later say, Tony changed the way of doing business in Las Vegas. He took control of everything. The first thing he did was bring in some of his own men and impose a street tax on every bookie, loan shark, drug dealer, and pimp in the city. If anyone refused to pay, Tony would kill them without a second thought and leave their body in a public place to signal to the rest of Las Vegas that a real gangster had arrived in town. Among Tony's crew in Las Vegas was his old friend Frank Cooler, who had just been released from prison after serving 6 years for participating in an armored truck robbery. When he arrived in Las Vegas, he was surprised at how quickly Tony had conquered the city. Tony was already running things, had everyone on the payroll, and even had a couple of guys in the sheriff's office and others in the courthouse who could get him jury records. He even had people in the phone company to inform him about wiretaps. While Tony had quickly consolidated himself as the king of the Las Vegas underworld, his spending habits, particularly his love for sports betting, ensured that he was always looking for quick money. With Frank in town, Tony told him to assemble a gang of thieves, and that as long as they gave him a cut from each job, they could rob whoever they wanted. Frank's new gang started by extorting everyone: bookies, loan sharks, drug dealers, pimps. They intimidated them, beat them up, and shot their guard dogs. What did they care? They had Tony's blessing. In fact, half the time, Tony told them who to hit. Then, after robbing them, they paid Tony for protection, having no idea that he was the one who had told Frank's gang to rob them in the first place. Frank's gang of thieves soon became infamous for their ability to break into any building undetected, no matter how tight the security. Because of their penchant for drilling holes in the wall or ceiling of the target building, the media began to call them the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang. Tony was at the peak of his power and ruled Las Vegas with an iron fist. Unlike the bosses in Chicago, he lived to be the center of attention and loved his media influence. Tony had the city covered. He was in the newspapers all the time, had women coming in Rolls-Royces wanting to date him. Everyone wanted to be close to a gangster, even movie stars. As Tony's notoriety increased, his ostentatious public persona only served to embarrass the local police and the FBI, who put together a task force of more than 20 officers with the sole purpose of taking him down. They placed a listening device on the roof of the Gold Rush, a jewelry store owned by Tony that he used as a base of operations for his criminal empire. However, it quickly became evident that even with all the surveillance, Tony was too smart and paranoid to talk about business in a way that could implicate him. Instead, he spoke to his subordinates in code or conveyed orders through body language, frowning or smiling to get his point across. Whenever he talked, he always covered his mouth, fearing that the FBI might have lip readers with binoculars watching him. Although the police couldn't obtain incriminating information on Tony by following him 24/7, they gained deeper insight into who he was as a person. He often worked 18-hour days at the Gold Rush, organizing various businesses and schemes, the details of which he never wrote down but kept all in his head. The FBI also learned about the strained relationship with his wife, Nancy. The two slept in separate beds and barely spoke, but when they did, it often involved an argument. Tony was also having an affair behind his wife's back. One day, while his girlfriend was visiting him at the Gold Rush, Nancy burst in and started yelling at him. Hearing the commotion, Tony came out of his office and began to violently beat his wife right there in the middle of the store, in front of all the customers. The FBI agents listening in became worried that Tony might kill his wife then and there, so they called 911, claiming to be workers from a nearby restaurant. They couldn't reveal their true identities because they feared that the Las Vegas police might be on Tony's payroll and would tip him off about the surveillance. By the time the police arrived at the Gold Rush, the situation had calmed down, and Nancy refused to press charges. In September 1972, it seemed that the Chicago police might achieve what had so far eluded the Las Vegas police and the FBI. Tony was charged with first-degree murder and extradited to Chicago to stand trial for his involvement in a killing in 1963. A Chicago Mafia hitman had recently switched sides and implicated Tony in the murder of a collector. The informant claimed that the victim had problems with the mobster Mad Sam, which culminated one day when the victim pointed a gun at Sam and threw him out of his office. A couple of days later, the man was lured to an abandoned house where he was tortured and killed by Sam and Tony Spilotro. While awaiting trial, Tony became increasingly worried about the behavior of his co-defendant, the infamous and eccentric Mad Sam. Sam had recently received a 3-year sentence for threatening to murder a witness and had even appeared at a court hearing wearing pajamas and sitting in a wheelchair while shouting through a megaphone. Tony was concerned that Sam's antics would make the jury more likely to rule against them. Just a month before the trial was set to begin, Sam scheduled a meeting with his brother and Tony in his garage. However, before the meeting could start, a masked man shot Sam twice with a shotgun before quickly disappearing. Although this murder was never solved, the FBI strongly suspected that Tony was the shooter and that he killed Sam to improve his chances at trial. Tony was subsequently found not guilty of all charges and immediately after the verdict was read in court, took the first plane back to Nevada. During his first 5 years in Las Vegas, the city recorded more homicides than in the previous 25 years combined. As a result, Tony faced the full weight of the US justice system. He was arrested numerous times, but never convicted. No matter how sophisticated the surveillance was, Tony always managed to stay one step ahead. The police constantly watched Tony, but he was now consumed by anger due to a completely different issue. His old friend and partner, Lefty Rosenthal, had taken the spotlight while Tony was preoccupied with his legal troubles. Lefty dealt with his own setbacks. Throughout much of 1976 and 1977, Lefty had been embroiled in a high-profile legal battle with the Nevada Gaming Commission, which refused to grant him a gaming license due to his alleged connections with organized crime. Lefty argued that the state was violating his constitutional rights, and although local courts routinely ruled against him, he was determined to fight all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary. This prolonged legal saga dominated the media, with Lefty routinely appearing on the front page of every newspaper in the state. Due to the lack of a valid gaming license, Lefty was appointed as the director of food and beverage for the Argent Corporation, the parent company that owned 4 casinos on the Las Vegas Strip and was secretly controlled by the mob. He was given this position because it was the highest title he could legally hold without a license. Newspaper, where he commented on current hot topics. He also launched The Frank Rosenthal Show, a talk show featuring casino performers and celebrity interviews. During its 2-year run, the show included legendary figures such as football player Jim Brown and even Frank Sinatra. Although the show aired sporadically when it was on, it was one of the most watched TV programs in the local area, turning Lefty into a Las Vegas star. This did not sit well with many of Lefty's Mafia associates, who were increasingly worried about the attention he was drawing to them. But the most annoyed person was Tony, who hated that Lefty was absorbing all the publicity that used to come his way. One night, after filming The Frank Rosenthal Show, Lefty went to a nightclub with an entourage. As they entered, everyone in the club stood up to shake his hand and wish him well. Everyone except Tony, who remained seated, seething with resentment. He proclaimed, "Look at that arrogant guy. Thinks he's too good to even come over here and say hello." While Lefty was on top of the world and enjoying the spotlight, Tony was forced to keep a low profile due to 24/7 police surveillance. Tony's influence in the criminal underworld had also significantly diminished due to his legal troubles, and by then, his crew was forced to do small-time jobs. One of the FBI agents assigned to his case would later say, "We have Spilotro running G errands more than running casinos." Frank later speculated that Tony's growing paranoia, combined with his jealousy of Lefty's fame, had caused a sort of psychotic break. Tony had become obsessed with delusions of grandeur, telling Frank that he planned to return to Chicago and eliminate the entire leadership of the outfit. When Frank pointed out that the powerful mobsters of New York, Kansas City, and Philadelphia would never allow such an action to take place, Tony shrugged and said he also would have to kill them. Tony saw himself as the second coming of Lucky Luciano and thought Lefty would be his Lansky. But after presenting his master plan to Lefty, who rejected it, Tony could see he was truly beginning to hate Lefty. He believed Lefty was ruining his parade. Tony wasn't alone in this hatred. Lefty's long-suffering wife, Jerry, had come to despise him for forcing her to have another child against her wishes. Tony soon began a love affair and insisted on keeping it as secret as possible. However, despite his best efforts, it eventually became known. But by 1978, Tony faced much bigger problems. Frustrated by their lack of success in convicting Tony, the Las Vegas police achieved a significant victory by persuading the Nevada Gaming Commission to include Tony's name in the infamous Black Book. This meant he was officially banned from entering any casino in the state. This move made it practically impossible for him to oversee the casino skim operation, which was the main reason the Chicago bosses had sent him there in the first place. To make matters worse, in the spring of '78, the FBI launched a massive raid on the gold rush involving over 50 agents. They seized everything from cash to recordings and financial records. The raid generated so much publicity that Tony found himself on the front page of every newspaper the following week. Although the raid turned out to be a massive failure with Tony and all his associates being released without charges, the bad press became another point of contention for the Chicago bosses. They quickly formed the opinion that Tony was causing more trouble than he was worth. The breaking point would come in 1981 when on July 4th, Frank and the entire hole-in-the-wall gang were arrested while attempting to break into a store they believed had a large amount of cash. As soon as they drilled through the roof, they were completely surrounded by a large number of police officers. This was because the alarm system specialist in the group had become an informant and had alerted the police about the group's plans. But they weren't the only ones arrested. In addition to the hole-in-the-wall gang, many of Chicago's top mobsters, including the outfit boss, were also charged for their roles in the casino skim operation. Ultimately, the bosses placed an exorbitant amount of blame directly on Tony for all the attention he had brought upon himself. However, Tony remained oblivious to this, and his main concern now was staying out of jail. He knew the government's case against him relied on the testimony of the gang's informant. Since Tony and the informant had never spoken face-to-face, the only person who could prove that Tony had ordered anything was Frank himself. One morning, while Frank was deeply asleep, he was awakened by the sound of gunshots. Looking outside, he saw that his neighbor had been shot dead, and a group of masked men quickly drove away in a van. A couple of weeks later, the FBI played Frank a recording of Tony putting out a contract on him. This was enough to convince Frank to betray Tony and agree to testify against him in court. Frank admitted to the police his involvement in over 6 murders ordered by Tony. He also confessed that his phone call ultimately led to Billy McCarthy's death. However, at trial, his testimony proved insufficient as it was his word against Tony's, and the police lacked solid evidence against him. Tony was acquitted once again at trial, but was soon charged again for his role in the casino skim operation. While out on bail, awaiting trial, Tony visited his brother Michael's house on June 14, 1986. Later, the two brothers left in Michael's car to meet with a high-ranking mobster in the hotel parking lot. The brothers believed that due to their efforts in Las Vegas, Tony was about to receive a promotion while his brother would become a made man. They got into the car, and all three traveled to a house 10 minutes away in the suburbs of Chicago for the ceremony they assumed was about to take place. Unbeknownst to the brothers, a few days earlier, all the remaining Chicago bosses who were not in prison held a secret meeting to discuss their upcoming court cases and the best course of action. All the men present agreed that their current misfortunes were solely Tony's fault for how he had managed things in Las Vegas, and they decided that Tony needed to be eliminated. So, when he and his brother arrived, they were taken to the basement where they were beaten to death by a group of 11 members of the Chicago outfit. Their bodies were then placed in the trunk of a car and driven for over an hour across the Illinois border into Indiana, where they were buried in a cornfield. Michael Ann reported the disappearance of both brothers on June 16th. On June 22nd, their bodies were found, one on top of the other, naked except for their underwear, buried in a cornfield in the Willow Slough Nature Preserve near Enos, Indiana. And that concludes the chilling tale of Tony Spilotro, a notorious figure whose life and crimes captivated an era. If you found this story intriguing, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more gripping tales from history's underworld. Stay tuned for our next episode. Thank you for watching.